Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've already got my European nightcrawler systems set up to be fed. I've gotten the food down here, I've got all the grit and bedding and materials that we're going to be using to do this today. I've even got my gloves on already. I'm all set to go. So let's get to work. Well, it was last week that I announced that I've got a game plan finally for harvesting this system, and it's not going to be for a while yet, because the bin is now at the age of 621 days old, and 700 days old is the target that I've set out. So I was going to make it 100 weeks from start to finish, from the time that I got these European night crawlers up until the time that I plan to harvest their castings. They've not always been in this container. They started out at one point in a much smaller container, and they've been gradually working their way up into the largest of my containers. And it's definitely a good sized container, and you can see there's plenty of room in here. I can keep going if I wanted to. But I've been promising myself and the viewers for some time now that I'm going to eventually get around to harvesting this system. So I figured I'd pin down the date, and it's a couple months away still, so I'm not in any sort of a particular rush. So today's feeding is not really targeting anything in specific, other than getting rid of some of my compostable materials. So I've got a couple coffee filters down here that we could use as bedding to go hand in hand with the food we're giving them. And I'm fairly sure that that's the way that we fed them last time too. So like we'll usually do in here, we'll pick around a little bit so we can get a closer look at how the last feeding is progressing. And then we'll drop in today's portion. It's been a week since this bin was last fed, since both of these European nightcrawler systems were last fed a week ago. Just wondering if some of this stuff I'm feeling here on top, this might be coffee, some leftovers from the previous feeding. I'm going to go down just a little bit here, at least make a little pit that we could drop today's food into. For some time I was not allowing myself to dig down in this container. I was forcing myself to top feed only, and then I eventually put that whole thing aside, and then I allowed myself to dig down into the container again to give myself visibility into how things are progressing down below the surface. As I probe down, I'm finally encountering stuff that might be part of the last feeding, might not be even. The last feeding I thought was just a coffee filter, a couple coffee filters with some veggies dropped into them. After a week's time, those coffee filters are usually still pretty much intact, especially with all this other bedding material floating around. This looks like a banana peel. It's also in pretty good shape still. There's all kinds of leftovers here, lots of bedding scraps. Look at all this. I piled up like an entire mound of leftover bits of bedding. It's making me wonder if I even want to add more bedding at this point. Maybe we just recycle what we've got here. So I got a couple leftover food bits here that I encountered too, besides the leftover bedding. A couple chunks of fruit, I believe. But a good amount of paper. This looks like maybe other chunks of fruits or vegetables. I can't tell what they are. They look like they're coming along pretty good. Getting broken down pretty nicely. Here too, we've got the end of some sort of a vegetable. This looks like it might have been pretty recently added, maybe from last week's feeding. This is a banana stem. Something like a banana stem is typically going to take a couple weeks to break down, depending on your circumstances. I did breeze through the last video pretty quickly, just to see if I can give myself a quick little refresher on what we did here last week. And the whole thing about pinning down 700 days of age as the target for migrating these worms out of this container and harvesting the castings was the one notable thing that I mentioned. All right, I've excavated a pretty good sized hole down in here. I believe that I'm going to do exactly what I mentioned earlier. I think we're just going to use all these old scraps right here. We'll lay down that material underneath the feeding today, and we'll probably just hold off on using these coffee filters till another time. So let's take all of this and see what it amounts to. Definitely a good amount of paper here. Not sure what it is exactly. I could see writing on it, so I think it's newspaper for the most part. I've been using coffee filters pretty regularly, but I don't see any material in here that's got no writing on it. It all seems to be some form of newsprint, as far as I could tell. So maybe they favor the coffee filters, which would make sense, because they've been soaked with coffee. They probably got some good flavor. So maybe they eat that stuff up first and leave the newspaper for last. I got some leftovers down here too. A couple scraps of veggie and fruit. Let's get all that stuff down into the feeding area too, and then we could drop in today's feeding. Here's one handful, kind of a small handful. Check this out. This is avocado seed. I remember somebody mentioning, you know, instead of placing it in whole like a big marble, because it's hard as heck when you do that, somebody said slice it up. And I couldn't believe that it was possible, but yesterday I took one and I took a knife to it, and it was able to be sliced pretty easily. So I've got a couple of them. They almost look like slices of apple. They started turning brown almost as soon as I cut them up. And I got a feeling it's going to break down pretty quick now that it's in very small, minute chunks as opposed to just being an entire seed. I've got a little bit of grit to give them too. We'll top off with some of my used coffee. Okay. Things look pretty good in here. I thought there'd be more leftovers for some reason. I don't know why. But I'm glad to see that they're doing away with what we give them. Maybe not all the bedding that they got. The bedding seems to stick around pretty good. There always seems to be plenty to salvage and reuse if needed. And I think that was fine doing it that way today. Skipping on adding bedding today. A lot of people will tell you that the night crawlers, you know, almost even prefer the bedding as a food source as opposed to the fresh kitchen scraps, you know, the carbon type materials, paper and leaves and stuff like that. And, you know, if that's the case, then maybe that'll be a good thing that we dropped a whole bunch of that bedding material down in there underneath the feeding area. So we'll see what becomes of it. I think we're done here. Let's get things covered up. Very nice. Okay, moving on. So here in this European nightcrawler system, we've got an environment that's been in service for 99 days now. And it's usually somewhere around the 100th day mark that I usually decide that I want to start steering a system towards harvest. It's funny, it's like here we have two European nightcrawlers linked up to one another, mating. And over there we've got the same thing going on. It's almost like this top section is where they come to get a little bit of privacy. to leave the contents of the bin and get busy. Let's just drop these two little mating pairs off the paper so we can remove the paper temporarily as we feed. There's a lot of casting material attached to this paper, but it's holding up pretty good, so we'll continue using it this way. I like having a sheet of paper across the top like that. I usually expect to see more than just 4 worms to greet us when we get in here, but those 4 worms were kind of a nice treat, seeing mating pairs in action. The moisture level is really nice in here. That plastic that was covering things up pretty much goes wall to wall, allowing for very little, if any, evaporation out of this container, I would assume. And I think that the moisture level being high is probably a good thing, because there's a lot of stuff in here that needs to be broken down. Everywhere I look, there's like a chunk of, I don't know what this is, some sort of like a mango seed husk. I could see chunks of bedding material. Everything seems lumpy. Makes you wonder, is it even necessary to feed a system that's got this much stuff floating around in it? I've actually thought about giving this system a chance just to sort of wind down a little bit and give them a little time to really work on all the existing stuff that's in here, as opposed to piling in more. But today I'm already equipped to give this bin a feeding, so we'll take care of doing that for sure. But maybe we'll let it ride for a while. Give the worms a chance to start breaking down all the little lingering bits of material that's floating around within this bin. See if we can come up with something that's got a slightly more fine consistency, as opposed to something that's all lumpy and chunky like this stuff is. I mean, I'm not saying that there's a problem with it. It just seems to me like it's evidence of a lot of material that needs time to break down. When things are this damp, I like to peek at the bottom, take a little look at what's happening at the very bottom of the container to see if there's pooled up liquid, little puddles happening. But I don't see that happening here. And I mean, even though there's a high degree of moisture and everything's completely damp, my glove also doesn't seem to be picking up any sort of muddy remnants. So that to me is usually a sign that things are in pretty good shape. Not too damp, basically. Even though it seems like it, you know, might be construed as being perhaps a little bit overly damp, I really don't think that's the case. So I think I'm going to just continue on with what I started here on the edge. I figured I would aerate things a little bit, kind of dislodge stuff if it's sort of packing down tight. I want to give the worms the opportunity to be able to move through this stuff pretty readily. I don't want it to be too dense. Not that I think that's a problem. I mean, I would think that they could probably work their way through just about anything. But if I can loosen things up a little bit here and there, I like to. It also introduces a little bit of air, a little bit of aeration into the material too, which I think is probably beneficial too. So we'll just check in on the outer edges really quick, aerate things a bit, fluff stuff up, make sure there's no pooled up water anywhere, and then we can drop in today's feeding. I'm even wondering if I want to use paper here too. I think here I probably will. Up until the age of maybe 100 days, I'm starting to think that it's probably still okay to add fresh bedding materials. But I think that if you're going to target something in the neighborhood of maybe 150 days of age as the point in time where you're going to harvest a bin, then it's probably a good idea at some point around now to start giving the worms a chance to break down whatever's in there already, as opposed to giving them more. Otherwise that stuff is just never going to break down. So here's some leftovers from the previous feeding. I can clearly see that this is still an intact coffee filter. It's even got some of the materials in it that were fed last time. Is this another one? Making me wonder if I want to add more today, or if I just want to recycle. I might have plenty of leftover paper material that we could reuse here too. I mean, for that matter, there's also quite a bit of leftover food in this particular one. The other two didn't look this way, but this one does have food scraps in it. But that's already like a third pretty good sized piece of paper. Coffee filters, all of them, I believe. So I'm questioning whether we really want to add another coffee filter or two to this bin. Might still be possible that those will get broken down if we do. Here's a good bit of leftovers again. It's making me wonder if today's feeding should be kind of sparse and limited. Maybe including bedding one more time. Include a couple filters to go with today's portion. But maybe not go too overboard and give them a little time afterwards to maybe start working all this stuff down that's already in here. Feels to me like I've probably been piling stuff into this bin even when it wasn't necessary, and maybe a little time is what this bin actually needs for the worms to get caught up on all this material that they could be chomping on. Here too, you know, good amount of moisture, but minimal amounts are sticking to my gloves, so it tells me we're probably okay. I think I will, despite my gut telling me I probably don't need to, I think I will just use a couple coffee filters with today's feeding. And then maybe what we'll do with this bin is we'll just let it ride for a while. Maybe we'll just let it sit, give the worms a chance to get caught up on all the materials that are in here. Because there is a plentiful amount of leftovers and bedding materials in here. So the food we're adding today is certainly not important because there's plenty of stuff for them to work on in here already. But I'm not going to worry too much about it. We'll just position all of this old stuff we encountered on the way down right down here in the middle. And then we'll just flank it on these two sides with the newly added materials. And I got a feeling that this bin is not going to need any attention for a little while. Certainly won't have to come back in here in another week's time to feed. I would bet that we could probably wait even a couple weeks before we check in on this one. But you know me, I like to check in a little more frequently than that, even if it's just to see how things are coming along. There's all kinds of little food scraps I encountered along the way, and if I can spot them, I'll chuck them back down into the feeding area. Luckily, we're pretty well covered with this container, with that plastic bag that we're covering up with, so I don't think we have to worry too much about a whole bunch of exposed food being out there in the open for the whatever, any sort of little flying insects to get drawn to. So I think we're in pretty good shape here. All these little sticks and stems too, you know, this stuff is going to need time as well. So 99 days of age. I don't know why, but for some reason at 99 days of age, I would almost expect the system to be a little bit more mature in terms of the material all being a lot more flaky and kind of break away and loose, but it's not really the case here. It seems like we've got, I don't know, maybe kind of a slow system here, or fewer worms than I thought. I mean, just from looking around, it does seem like we've got ourselves a pretty good sized population in here. So I don't think that that's the problem. Maybe it's just the type of worm. These are European night crawlers. I think my red wigglers are pretty comfortable in the cool temperatures, burning through the materials that they get to break down, but I think these night crawlers might have a slightly slower metabolism or something. Okay, I think things are pretty level here, so we'll begin reassembling what we took apart here. This will indicate to us that we fed right down here in the middle. this piece of paper on top of that will pretty much just serve as sort of a landing pad for any of the moisture that recirculates as a result of the plastic coverings being on the container. And it'll continue to be sort of a haven for the worms to come hang out on and mate if that's what they want to do there. Seems to be what they want to do there. And we'll get things covered up here. Okay, so I think that's it for today as far as the European night crawlers are concerned. Might not have even been necessary to come in here. I mean, maybe in the VermiBag mini that we just took care of feeding before, maybe it was necessary to add a little bit of food because the leftovers in there were very minimal, but we had a pretty good amount of leftovers in here. So I got a feeling maybe if we come back down here to feed at some point, we might skip this one during the next feeding and just give them time to get caught up. All right, everyone, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.